I don't know if you remember that when Obama made his first trip to Russia, about 6 months after he was elected, protocol did call for him to meet with Medvedev, who's the president, Putin's the prime minister. But it didn't require him to say, I look forward to meeting President Medvedev, because Putin is a man with one foot in the Cold War. He said that publicly. That was bad. Particularly bad since the Russian political class does not support Medvedev. It supports Putin. And it really pissed them off. And they've done that in other ways along the way. So this kind of blame Putin for everything that's bad, that we ourselves did at least part of, has been passed on from Clinton to Bush to Obama. And it makes the reset fragile, because if you can't agree on what happened yesterday, you're unlikely to cooperate tomorrow. Any of us. And that's particularly true of states. Of course, we have policymakers who don't believe in history. They have no historical memory whatsoever. They live in a state of constant either historical stupor or amnesia or some kind of narcomania. They have no memory of history. The Russians never forget anything. And they think about it and they brood about it every day. Probably both afflictions are bad, but we really ought to have some sense of what they're talking about, some memory of what happened only 15, 20 years ago, and we don't. Secondly, the reset, apart from the personal supporters of Obama and Medvedev, has almost no political support in either country, in Moscow or Washington. I did recently a collection of the attacks on Obama for the reset, and they're really beyond, they're just unspeakable. The Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, the New Republic, they basically say Obama's betrayed our allies, he's exhibited weakness. One person called it a new Nazi-Soviet pact. I mean, he has no support for this other than his inner group. And Medvedev has no support for the reset in Moscow. If you think there's no freedom of speech in Russia, consider this. About 3 weeks ago, a general published in a very widely circulated Russian newspaper the charge that the Americans stood behind Medvedev, that he was a stooge of the United States, who had been planted in the Kremlin to preserve American control of Europe. So both leaders are essentially being accused of traitorous policies for the reset. Still worse, they're both weak leaders. Both of them are on the ropes. Neither is guaranteed a second term. If one or both goes in 2012, it's far from clear that one or the other's successor will support the reset. And the political class knows this. It's not afraid of either of them, to the degree that people in Washington and in Moscow have been sabotaging the reset. This is a separate story, but it's very obvious. It's stunning in some ways. They just aren't afraid of the leaders, these two guys. Or they don't think they're going to be around long enough to do anything about it. So this policy, as valuable and important as it is very fragile politically. Then finally, even even the one claim that the reset has, the new nuclear reductions agreement, is terribly fragile. First of all, it isn't new. We had them for 45 years. But it's good, but it's fragile. I don't know whether you know this, but in order to get the Senate, which had never before refused to ratify a nuclear reduction treaty, to ratify it, Obama had to write a letter to the Senate promising that he would max out on missile defense in Europe. He had promised the Russians he wouldn't. The Russians see this as another broken promise by an American president. So Obama might have on the telephone winked a few times at Medvedev, like, pay no attention, I got to tell these clowns this to get this treaty ratified. The problem is that if you go back and read the Senate resolution of ratification, it calls for a full implementation of all 4 stages of missile defense, which means putting sights on Russia's borders. And Russia has said repeatedly that if any sites are built on its borders, it's going to withdraw from this treaty. Well, you say, how can you withdraw from a treaty? Well, George Bush did, didn't he? The ABM treaty. So we set that precedent too. This treaty, I fear, is not going to last, or it's not going to be implemented. because missile defense is going to kill it as long as we insist, as the Senate does, and apparently Obama has decided, as he usually does, to go along, to implement this thing. Then there's the whole problem of the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders. No country, reset or not, that feels itself threatened by a foreign military alliance encroaching into its security space is ever going to be a partner of that alliance, period. Anybody with the slightest bit of common sense knows this. You are not going to have a strategic partnership with Russia so long as the American-led NATO is ringing Russia with NATO-American military bases, which continues. Airstrips are being built as we talk. Mobile artillery is being moved from Germany to Bulgaria and Romania, all that. That was Rumsfeld's idea. But Obama seemed to like it, he didn't stop it. And there's even a larger problem, which I bet you haven't thought about. But I ask you to. But it is heresy. The Russians have said, particularly under Putin, and this is why we say he's a very bad man, that they are entitled to what they call a sphere of privileged interest in the former Soviet territories. You remember that in addition to Russia, there were 14 republics of the Soviet Union, and they all became separate independent states after December 1991. So these 14 states, which ring Russia, were part of the Soviet Union. Moscow said, we have privileged security interest here. We have certain rights here. And we want Washington to acknowledge what they call this sphere of privileged interest. Washington's reaction is, screw you. You can't have it. Nobody can have a sphere of influence in the world today because it's an evil remnant of the 19th century. It's not democratic. It's not just. It's not fair to other countries. Well, we all probably say that's so. There's only one problem with this. That, of course, the expansion of NATO to Russia's former zone of security is probably the single most dramatic and expansive extension of the American sphere of influence in the history of the United States. I mean, in just a few years, we've expanded our sphere of influence. What else is NATO? And it's not just military equipment. It's music. They have to buy their weapons from our people. It's our food. Their women date our men. It's a vast expansion of America's sphere of influence by any standard, all through Eastern Europe to Russia's borders. And Russia says, of course, this is hypocrisy of the worst sort, and we aren't going to stand for it, but there's not much they can do about it. So the reset's going to go nowhere when we have this conflict over who's entitled to a sphere of influence. So that brings me, on that note, is there a way out? Can the reset, and I don't even like the word reset because a watch can be turned forward or backward, but can, it used to be called détente, but can an American policy of improving relations with Russia so we can achieve the necessary strategic relationship with Russia for our own national security, can a way out be found? The basic problem, the basic institutionalized problem is, of course, NATO expansion and the projection of America's sphere of influence into Russia's backyard. This is the rock-bed, institutionalized legacy of unwise policy since the end of the Soviet Union made in Washington, and continued, I fear, by the Obama administration. We begin to cope with this by, first of all, understanding what Russia's complaint is. Just listening. We don't listen. Secondly, we have to abandon three myths that are so dear to us, we keep teaching them to our children. We did not win the Cold War. The Cold War ended sometime, if it did end, between 1988 and 1990, 2 full years before the Soviet Union ended. This conflation of the end of the Soviet Union with the end of the Cold War, which has become part of the American triumphalist narrative, and we now write into our textbooks, is false. It didn't happen. And even Reaganites will tell you it didn't happen. It's just something that the first Bush later made up in his campaign against Clinton to try to hold on to the White House. And the media picked it up and said, yeah, it's so, and it's been with us ever since. We won the Cold War. We have to abandon this because the Russians don't see it this way, and they never will. Second is, we have to abandon this notion that we are now the only superpower. You've all heard that. There are no longer any superpowers. The world is different. The world is reinventing itself in terms of the use of power. Anyway, if we were still a superpower in the conventional sense, we would not be bogged down in two wars we cannot possibly win. We would not be defied by a puny state like Iran. We would not be enmeshed in the worst economic crisis in 3 generations. And the top contenders for the heavyweight boxing championship of the world would not all be former Soviet citizens. They used to be Americans, remember? We used to identify the heavyweight championship with our superpower. Moreover, we're really considered lucky when we managed to get to the final round of the World Basketball Championships, which we didn't for 3 years in a row. So the superpower stuff is for children. And it's even dangerous for children because they'll grow up into adults who will believe it. The other myth is that Russia needs us to be a great power. This is nonsense. Unreported in the American press is that today 2 bilateral relationships are much more important to Moscow than its relationship with Moscow. That's its relationship with Beijing and its relationship with Berlin. These are Russia's 2 most important partners in the world today. Everything except nuclear security they can get from Berlin and China. They don't need us. They don't need our know-how, our investment, our technology, our political advice. But they do need the nuclear security, and we need their nuclear security. Which brings us back to the essential partnership. One problem is that Obama has continued this tradition of American presidents looking for a friend in the Kremlin. They should be looking for a partner, not a friend. You remember, I think, that Nixon and Brezhnev said they were friends. Remember that? They hung out together, they gave each other cars. They actually liked each other. They were a lot alike. Clinton and Yeltsin, 2 big beefy guys from the provinces, they said they were really friends. Old Bill and old Boris, you remember that? And the second Bush looked in Putin's soul and said he saw a friend of America. And yet, through all these personal friendships, the relationship got worse and worse. It's not about having a friend in the Kremlin. It's about having a partner in Russia who has support in the Russian political class and who will defend the partnership not because they like it, but because it's in Russia's interest. The same way why we should defend the partnership. Not because we think Medvedev is cute and Putin isn't, but because it's essential to our national security. But finally, what do we do then about this biggest problem of NATO expansion and the spheres of influence? And my proposal requires a compromise on both sides. So far as I know, no American has ever advocated it in public, except me. It was not popular and isn't likely to be. I think most fair-minded Americans would agree that Russia does in fact have one privileged interest in its own neighborhood, and that's the absence of foreign military bases. I think we'd say that's reasonable. Why would we say it? Because we're sensible, fair-minded people, but also because we went to the brink of nuclear war in 1962 to defend that right for the United States against Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba. We were prepared to go to nuclear war to defend the principle that there could not be foreign military bases in our sphere of security, right? Right? So why shouldn't the Russians feel just as tense about this? And why shouldn't we understand that they don't want a bunch of Cubas along their borders? What's the solution? Well, it's twofold, and it's rather simple. Washington announces that NATO expansion is over, no more. I mean, there's no more place to expand to anyway, unless you're going to bring Afghanistan in. And more likely, NATO's going to die in Afghanistan. But it's over. It's finished. Make up any excuse you want. You know, remember Phil Oakes? The war's over. NATO expansion's over. That's it. But that still leaves all these military bases, NATO bases, in Russia's backyard. And here, this requires a major American accommodation. All American and NATO troops east of Germany should be withdrawn. We cannot expel these countries from NATO, these 12 or 15 countries we brought into NATO. But when we took them in, we told the Russians that there would be no military bases in these countries, and we broke that promise. We could now honor that promise and withdraw NATO and American troops from all the NATO countries east of Germany. It would not violate NATO's collective security pledge. They'd still be bound to defend each other if attacked. But it would end the military encirclement of Russia. And I think Russia then would be ready for a real partnership. In return, Russia needs, publicly or by treaty, to acknowledge the political sovereignty of all these countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. If they want to elect a crackpot like Saakashvili, Russia's just going to have to live with it and stop trying to overthrow it. And that's true in Belarus, in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in Central Asia, wherever. Grow up and live with it. If these two great nuclear powers took this step, we would have the security we want, and we would have a partner to do the three things we need done: control of these vast nuclear arsenals, real vigilance against the proliferation of radioactive material, because it's seeping out of Russia. It's a Walmart of this stuff. And a real alliance to combat terrorism. Russia's become the main target of terrorism today. You know, they want this partnership very much. We've become a little complacent since nothing big's happened since 9/11. But it will. It will, of course, eventually. But Russia's being hit practically every month. Horrible things. Most recently, the airport was blown, as you know. Neither America nor Russia has anything to lose from such an accommodation, which should have taken place when the Soviet Union ended. And it has, both sides have everything to gain. So I'll end by saying that when you've been doing what I do, talking about Russia, for as long as I have, people always say, I don't like it. They always say, are you an optimist or a pessimist about our relationship? And I finally have thought of an answer, which was given to me by Russians. Because when you ask a Russian if they're optimist or they're a pessimist about world affairs, they always say, well, I'm an optimist. But of course, an optimist is an uninformed pessimist. And I will leave the rest of it to our discussion.